Hi, everyone. Was Korach really such a smart man? On the one hand, Chazal seem almost complimentary. Rashi, quoting the Medrash, calls him a pikeach, a perceptive man, a man with insight. And indeed, if we step back for a moment, Korach was remarkably gifted. He could ask brilliant questions. He could make complicated Torah concepts sound absurd. If an entire garment is blue, why should it need one blue string of techeles? If an entire house is filled with Sifrei Torah, why should it need a mezuzah on the doorpost? Now, whether these arguments were valid or not was almost besides the point. He knew how to make people think. He knew how to make people laugh. He knew how to gather crowds. Today, we'd probably say he had charisma, media savvy, and extraordinary communication skills. But that only deepens the mystery. If he was so perceptive, how could he have been so blind? I mean, something about Korach just doesn't add up. After all, his public message was Ki kol ha'eda kulam kedoshim. The entire nation is holy. Why should anyone be above anyone else? Yet privately, his message was exactly the opposite. He wasn't arguing against leadership. He was arguing that he should be the leader. So which was it? Was leadership unnecessary? Or was leadership acceptable as long as Korach was holding the position? The contradiction should have been obvious. Yet somehow, 253 distinguished leaders followed him. Why? Perhaps we're asking the wrong question. Instead of asking, why did Korach rebel? Perhaps we should ask, why did Korach wait? His grievance wasn't new. You see, Chazal and the Medrash tell us he was upset that Elitzaphan ben Uziel had been appointed the Nasi Beisav, the prince of the family, instead of Korach. And that appointment happened way back in Parshas Bamidbar. So why remain silent through the complaints and the quail, the slav, and all the earlier crises, and only rebel now? Why now? Ramban gives a remarkable answer. You see, until now, Moshe Rabbeinu was untouchable. Every crisis only strengthened the people's confidence in him. At the Egel Azav, at the golden calf, he davened, and the nation survived. Whenever disaster struck, Moshe stood between the Shamayim and the people, and his credibility was absolute. You see, until now, no one would have listened to Korach. But then came the Meraglim. For the very first time, the decree remained. The people heard 40 years in the desert, an entire generation that would never enter Eretz Yisrael. And suddenly the people began asking questions. Where was Moshe? Why didn't he save us this time? And Korach immediately recognized something no one else noticed. The people weren't angry. They were disappointed. And disappointed people become willing to question the leaders that they once trusted. And that was Korach's genius. He didn't create the frustration, he harvested it. That's what made him a pikeach. But wait a minute. The Ramban seems difficult. Didn't Moshe Rabbeinu daven? The Torah in last week's Parsha recorded an entire heartfelt tefillah at the time of the return of the Meraglim. Hashem himself says, Salachti, I forgive you, kidvarecha, according to your words. So what does the Ramban mean that Moshe didn't pray? The Ramban explains something astonishing. Moshe davened with every fiber of his being, but this time, the decree could not be completely removed. You see, instead of immediate destruction, Moshe obtained something almost unimaginable. The nation would survive. The next generation would enter the land. The punishment would become rehabilitation instead of annihilation. Moshe understood what he accomplished. It's the people who didn't. They looked at the outcome and assumed if the decree still stands, he must not have tried hard enough. They judged efforts by results. Korach saw that misunderstanding and quietly poured gasoline on it. Now Rashi becomes crystal clear. Rashi doesn't call Korach a chacham, a wise man. He calls him a pikeach. The Rambam explains that a pikeach is someone who reveals another perspective. Korach certainly did that. But revealing another perspective is not the same thing as discovering truth. You see, a chacham searches for truth, but a pikeach notices opportunities. A chacham asks, what's right? A pikeach asks, what can I do with what I can see? A pikeach asks, what do I see that others don't? But a chacham asks, what might everyone else see that I'm missing? The tragedy is that Korach kept opening everyone else's eyes while closing his own. Perhaps we can put it this way. The first pikchus in Tanakh occurs when Hagar suddenly sees the well that had been there all along. Pikchus means seeing something others missed. Korach had that gift. The tragedy is that he could see everyone else's blind spots except his own. Korach wasn't wise enough to discover the truth. He was clever enough to discover weakness. The Vilna Gaon actually notes that pikchus is often the ability to perceive worldly realities. Korach could read a room. He could sense public opinion. He could identify the emotional fault lines in the nation. But he mistook political instinct for spiritual vision. He saw where the people were vulnerable, yet he failed to see where Hashem was leading them. And perhaps that's the greatest danger of intelligence divorced from humility. You begin seeing opportunities instead of truth. But why did the people believe him? Because Korach did something every successful manipulator does. He mixed truth with falsehood. He was right that the leaders must care. He was wrong that Moshe no longer cared. He was right that every Jew is kadosh, is holy. He was wrong that kedusha, holiness, eliminates authority. He was right that people need someone to advocate for them, but he was wrong that Moshe stopped advocating. You see, falsehood by itself rarely persuades. It's emes when it's mixed with sheker that becomes dangerous. There's another lesson here that's also painfully relevant. Rav Yisachar Fran once recalled an old General Motors advertisement. The advertisement said, "What have you done for me lately?" Now, whether or not that's a uniquely American idea is besides the point. It's certainly not uniquely Jewish. Look what happened. Moshe took them out of Mitzrayim. He split the sea. He brought them the Torah. He saved them after the Egel Hazav, the golden calf. He fed them. He protected them. He led them. He loved them. And one perceived disappointment erased decades of loyalty. And that's what happens when gratitude disappears. Hakaras Hatov is not simply remembering yesterday's kindness. Hakaras Hatov changes how we interpret today's disappointment. Without gratitude, one painful moment rewrites an entire history. With gratitude, an entire history gives context to one painful moment. And there's one final lesson. The people made one tragic mistake. They concluded that Moshe no longer cared. They were wrong. But notice something a little remarkable here. They were right about one thing. If a leader truly stops caring, he or she cannot lead. Theodore Roosevelt famously observed, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. The late Mrs. Chaya Newman, a stellar educator, sharpened that insight. People don't know how much you care until they know that you care. Moshe cared more than anyone. The tragedy was that the people stopped seeing it. So what does this mean for us? Perhaps every one of us should ask 3 questions before we criticize, before we forward that WhatsApp message, before we join the conversation, before we lose confidence in a spouse or a parent or a rebbe or a rav or a friend or a child or a community leader. Question number 1 we should ask ourselves, am I seeing the whole picture or only the outcome? Question number 2, has one disappointment caused me to forget years of kindness? Question number 3, Am I listening to someone who's helping me discover the truth, or merely helping me to justify my frustration? Those three questions could save marriages and relationships. They could save friendships. They could save communities. Perhaps that's why Chazal called Korach a Pikeach. He could see what everyone else was feeling, but he could no longer see beyond himself. Korach lost his soul not because he stopped asking questions. He lost his soul because he stopped questioning himself. And perhaps that's the warning of Parshas Korach. The greatest danger is not that we might become foolish. The greatest danger is that we become so convinced by what we see that we stop asking what we might be missing. Korach saw an opportunity. Moshe saw a nation worth saving. A Pikech sees what others overlook. But a Chacham knows that no one, not even himself, sees the whole picture. And perhaps that's why humility is greater than brilliance, because humility keeps asking the question that Korach never asked. What if there's something I still don't see? That question doesn't merely prevent rebellions. It preserves relationships. It protects friendships. It strengthens communities. And perhaps most importantly, it keeps us close to the Ribono Shel Olam, whose picture is always infinitely larger than the one that you and I think we can see. Wishing you and yours a Shabbat Shalom and a Shabbat Shalom to all.